a journey through golden light. Let the tension drain from your shoulders. Feel your breathing deepen and slow. Tonight, we journey into the realm of light itself, into the story of the most beautiful of all the gods, the one who brought music to Olympus and prophecy to humanity. Apollo, the golden god, the far shooter, the lord of the silver bow, master of the lyre, patron of the muses, keeper of the most sacred oracle the ancient world ever knew. He was god of the sun that illuminates all things, god of truth that cannot hide in darkness, god of music that brings harmony to chaos, god of healing that drives away disease, god of archery whose arrows never miss their mark. From the moment of his miraculous birth on the sacred island of Delos, Apollo shaped the world of gods and mortals alike. He slew the monstrous Python and claimed Delphi as his sanctuary, where priestesses would speak his prophecies for 1,000 years. He loved mortals and immortals, with a passion that often ended in tragedy. Daphne transformed into laurel, Hyacinthus into a flower, Coronis killed by his own arrows. He brought plague and healing, death and life, vengeance and mercy. Tonight we'll explore his dramatic birth, his conquest of Delphi, his mastery of music and prophecy, his tragic love affairs, his terrible acts of vengeance, and his enduring legacy that shaped civilization itself. So settle deeper into comfort, let your mind open to these ancient stories, and prepare to meet the god of light and art, of prophecy and punishment, whose brilliance still illuminates our understanding of beauty, truth, and the power of divine creativity. The golden god of light. Before we dive into the extraordinary tales that made Apollo one of the most important deities in the Greek pantheon, we need to understand something fundamental about his nature. Apollo was not a simple god. He wasn't defined by a single domain or characteristic. Instead, he embodied multiple aspects of civilization, culture, and cosmic order, combining them into a single divine personality that the ancient Greeks found both inspiring and terrifying. Apollo was, first and foremost, a god of light, not just physical light, though he was indeed associated with the sun, often conflated with Helios, the actual personification of the sun, but light in a metaphorical sense as well. Light that reveals truth, that drives away shadow and deception, that illuminates the path forward. Apollo represented clarity, the piercing vision that sees through confusion to essential reality. His epithets reflected this. Phoebus Apollo, meaning bright or pure, emphasized his radiant nature. This association with light extended into his role as god of truth and prophecy. Apollo's oracle at Delphi was the most trusted source of divine wisdom in the ancient Greek world, consulted by kings and commoners alike before making important decisions. Through the Pythia, his priestess, Apollo revealed what was hidden, spoke truths about future events, gave guidance that, though often cryptic, was believed to be utterly reliable. Truth and light were inseparable in Apollo's nature. But Apollo was also a god of music and the arts. He played the lyre with such skill that even the other gods stopped to listen. He led the muses, those 9 goddesses who inspired all creative endeavor, in their songs and dances on Mount Parnassus. Poetry, song, dance, all artistic expression found its divine patron in Apollo. The ancient Greeks believed that music created cosmic harmony, that it reflected the mathematical order underlying all existence. Apollo, as master musician, embodied this principle. Interestingly, Apollo was also a god of healing and medicine. His son Asclepius became the greatest healer in mythology, and and Apollo himself could cure diseases, or cause them. His arrows could bring plague and death, but his knowledge could also drive illness away. This duality reflected an important truth. The same God who could harm could also heal. The same power that brought disease could cure it. Apollo represented the understanding that destruction and creation, harm and healing, were different expressions of the same divine force. Apollo was additionally the god of archery. His silver bow, forged by Hephaestus, never missed its target. When Apollo drew back his bowstring, death followed inevitably. He was called the far shooter, Apollo Hakaergos, because his arrows could strike from vast distances with perfect accuracy. This wasn't mindless violence. Apollo's archery represented precise, calculated force applied at exactly the right moment to achieve a specific end. His arrows were instruments of divine justice, punishment for hubris or offense against the gods. The god was also remarkably beautiful. In Greek art and poetry, Apollo appears as the ideal of male beauty, eternally youthful, perfectly proportioned, graceful, radiant. The Greeks had a concept called kalos kagathos, meaning beautiful and good, the idea that physical beauty reflected inner virtue. Apollo embodied this ideal completely. His beauty wasn't superficial, but represented his divine perfection, the harmony and order he brought to the cosmos. Apollo had a twin sister, Artemis, goddess of the hunt, the wilderness, and the moon, where Apollo was associated with civilization, art, cities, and ordered life. Artemis represented wild nature, untamed forests, the hunt, yet they were deeply connected, two sides of a coin. Apollo the sun, Artemis the moon, Apollo the civilized, Artemis the wild, Apollo the god of music, Artemis the goddess of the hunt. They loved each other fiercely, protected their mother Leto together, and shared the silver bow as their weapon of choice. Born to Zeus, king of the gods, and Leto, a titaness, Apollo's parentage was impeccable. He was an Olympian from birth, destined for greatness. But his birth story itself was dramatic and difficult, shaped by the jealousy of Hera, Zeus's wife, who could not forgive Zeus's infidelities or tolerate the children born from his affairs with other goddesses and mortal women. In the divine hierarchy, Apollo occupied a place of tremendous importance. He sat among the 12 Olympians, the principal deities who ruled from Mount Olympus. Zeus trusted him, relied on his counsel, valued his judgment. Apollo represented order, civilization, rational thought, all things Zeus valued in maintaining cosmic stability, where Dionysus represented ecstasy and the dissolution of boundaries. Apollo represented sobriety and the maintenance of proper limits. The ancient Greeks saw these as complementary forces, Dionysian chaos and Apollonian order, both necessary, both valuable, kept in balance. Apollo's relationship with mortals was complex. He loved humans genuinely, passionately, sometimes tragically. Unlike some gods who viewed mortals as insignificant or merely amusing, Apollo engaged deeply with human life. He fell in love with mortal men and women. He fathered children who became heroes, healers, musicians. He intervened in human affairs, sometimes helpfully, sometimes destructively. His loves often ended badly. Daphne transformed into a tree to escape him, Hyacinthus accidentally killed, Coronis slain for betrayal, but they were genuine. Apollo felt deeply, loved intensely, and suffered when those he loved were lost. This emotional depth made Apollo relatable despite his divine power. He wasn't distant or incomprehensible. He experienced desire, jealousy, grief, joy. the full range of emotions that humans knew. This made him accessible as a god, someone mortals could understand and connect with, even while recognizing his vast superiority. Apollo was also associated with youth and beardless vigor, unlike Zeus, who was portrayed as mature and bearded, or Poseidon with his full beard. Apollo remained eternally young. The Greeks called him Kouros, the eternal youth, the perfect young man in his prime. This perpetual youth symbolized vitality, potential, the future. Apollo represented what young men aspired to become: beautiful, skilled, strong, wise, accomplished in arts and war. The god had his darker aspects too. He could be vengeful, even cruel. When Niobe boasted that her 14 children made her superior to Leto, who had only 2, Apollo and Artemis, Apollo and his sister slaughtered all of Niobe's children as punishment for her hubris. When Marsyas, a satyr, challenged Apollo to a musical contest and lost, Apollo flayed him alive. When the Trojan princess Cassandra rejected his advances after accepting his gift of prophecy, he cursed her so that no one would ever believe her true visions. Apollo's justice was absolute, his vengeance terrible, his expectations of respect unwavering. But this wasn't simple cruelty. To the ancient Greeks, Apollo's harsh punishments represented the enforcement of cosmic order, the maintenance of proper hierarchies, the punishment of hubris, that excessive pride that led mortals to forget their place and challenge the gods. Apollo's vengeance was terrible precisely because order and truth were sacred, and violations demanded severe consequences. Apollo also represented colonization and civilization spread. When Greek cities sent out colonists to establish new settlements, they consulted Apollo's oracle at Delphi for guidance on where to go and how to organize their new communities. Apollo thus became associated with the expansion of Greek culture, the spread of Hellenic civilization throughout the Mediterranean. His oracles guided the founding of cities from Sicily to the Black Sea. The god symbols were numerous and meaningful: the lyre, music and harmony; the bow, precision and power; the laurel wreath, victory and poetry; the tripod, prophecy; the sun, light and truth; the swan, beauty and grace; the raven, prophecy; the dolphin, transformation and guidance. Each symbol told part of Apollo's story, represented an aspect of his nature. In worship, Apollo received hymns called paeans, songs of praise, petition, or thanksgiving sung in his honor. These weren't gloomy or solemn, but joyful and triumphant, celebrating Apollo's victories, his beneficence, his power. The most famous paean was sung after his defeat of Python, establishing his oracle at Delphi, and variations of this hymn were sung at his festivals for centuries. Apollo's influence extended into every aspect of Greek life. Musicians sought his inspiration. Poets invoked his name. Healers called on his knowledge. Leaders consulted his oracles before major decisions. Athletes competed in games held in his honor. Cities built temples to him. He wasn't a distant god worshipped out of fear, but an active presence in Greek culture, shaping art, music, medicine, politics, and as daily life. The ancient Greeks saw Apollo as representing the best of what both gods and humans could be: beautiful, talented, knowledgeable, powerful, yet capable of love, creativity, and a genuine connection. He was terrifying when angered, gentle when pleased, passionate in love, terrible in vengeance, brilliant in art, unerring in judgment. He was, in many ways, the complete god, combining so many domains that he almost became a summary of divine power itself. second perhaps only to Zeus in importance. This is the god we're about to explore in depth: Apollo Phoebus, the bright one; Apollo Loxias, the ambiguous one; Apollo Pythios, destroyer of Python; Apollo Musagetes, leader of the Muses. His myths are filled with drama, tragedy, triumph, and transformation. His birth was miraculous, his conquests legendary, his loves tragic, his vengeance terrible, his gifts to humanity invaluable. Understanding Apollo means understanding how the ancient Greeks viewed truth, beauty, art, justice, and a complex relationship between mortals and the divine. From the moment he emerged from his mother's womb on the sacred island of Delos, Apollo was destined to be extraordinary, and his story, filled with monsters slain, oracles established, loves lost, and legacies created, remains one of the richest and most influential in all of mythology. The miraculous birth on Delos. To understand Apollo, we must start at his beginning. A birth so difficult, so dramatic, and so consequential that it shaped not just his life, but the entire religious landscape of ancient Greece. This wasn't a simple divine birth, but an ordeal that lasted 9 days and nights, involved the persecution of his mother across the entire world, and ended with a transformation of a barren floating island into one of the most sacred sites in Greek religion. The story begins with Leto, a titaness of great beauty and modesty. She was the daughter of the titans Coeus and Phoebe, which made her part of the older generation of gods, those who had ruled before Zeus and the Olympians overthrew them. But Leto hadn't sided with the titans in that great war, and after Zeus's victory, she remained free while other titans were imprisoned in Tartarus. Zeus noticed Leto. How could he not? She was beautiful, gentle, modest, everything that might catch the eye of the king of gods, who had an unfortunate habit of noticing beautiful goddesses and pursuing them despite being married to Hera. Zeus's affair with Leto resulted in pregnancy, twins, though this wasn't immediately known. And the moment Hera discovered that her husband had impregnated another goddess, her legendary jealousy erupted into terrible action. Hera couldn't harm Zeus directly. He was too powerful, and besides, he was her husband and king. But she could and did make Leto's life absolutely miserable. Hera decreed that Leto would not be able to give birth on any land that saw the sun. She forbade any place on terra firma, the mainland, the islands, anywhere settled and stable, from providing shelter to Leto when her time came to deliver the twins. This was no small curse. In the ancient world, childbirth was dangerous even under the best circumstances. Without shelter, without help, without a safe place to rest, giving birth could easily be fatal for both mother and child. Hera essentially condemned Leto to wander endlessly, growing ever more pregnant, unable to find refuge, suffering and desperate. But Hera's persecution didn't stop there. She also sent Python, a monstrous serpent or dragon that served her, to pursue Leto constantly. This creature hunted the pregnant titaness across the world, ensuring she could never rest, never feel safe, never have a moment's peace. The python was enormous and terrifying, a servant of the earth goddess Gaia. Before Hera commandeered it for this vengeful purpose, wherever Leto went, Python followed, forcing her to keep moving despite her exhaustion and advanced pregnancy. Leto wandered desperately from place to place. She begged cities and islands to give her sanctuary, to allow her to rest long enough to give birth. But everywhere she went, she was refused. The people and places were terrified of Hera's wrath. If they sheltered Leto, the queen of the gods would punish them terribly. Better to turn away one suffering Titaness than face the endless rage of Hera. Can you imagine this journey? Leto, divine though she was, pregnant with twins, exhausted beyond measure, pursued by a monster, rejected by every land she approached, growing more desperate with each refusal. The ancient sources describe her wandering through Crete, through the Cyclades Islands, through mainland Greece, always searching, always denied, always moving. Zeus, for all his power, seemed unable or unwilling to intervene directly. Perhaps Hera's curse was too strong, or perhaps Zeus simply didn't want to escalate the conflict with his wife. Whatever the reason, Leto was largely on her own, dependent on her own resources and whatever help she could find. Finally, after endless searching, Leto came to a small, barren, floating island called Asteria. This island had once been Leto's sister, the Titaness Asteria, who had transformed herself into a quail, and then an island to escape Zeus's advances. Yes, Zeus had pursued both sisters, though only Leto had yielded to him. The island Asteria, named after her former self, was unique. It wasn't fixed to the ocean floor, but floated freely on the sea. Because it moved, it technically wasn't land, in the way Hera's curse defined it. The island wasn't stable terra firma, but something in between earth and sea. Moreover, Asteria was so small and barren that no one else wanted it. It had no cities, no temples, no inhabitants. It produced nothing valuable. It was just a floating rock. And precisely because it was insignificant, Hera hadn't specifically forbidden it from sheltering Leto. The Queen of Gods hadn't even considered it important enough to include in her curse. When Leto approached Asteria, the island spoke to her. Or perhaps Leto spoke to the island, pleading for sanctuary. Different versions tell this differently, but the core point is the same. Asteria agreed to let Leto give birth there. The island had nothing to lose, really. It was already insignificant and unvalued. By helping Leto, it might gain something. Importance, sacredness, the favor of Zeus and his children. It was a gamble, but Asteria took it. Leto collapsed on the island, finally able to rest after her endless wandering. But her ordeal wasn't over. Hera, furious that Leto had found even this loophole, enacted another cruelty. She kidnapped Eileithyia, the goddess of childbirth, holding her prisoner on Olympus. Without Eileithyia present, Leto couldn't complete the birthing process. She went into labor, but the babies couldn't be born. She suffered in childbirth for 9 days and 9 nights. An impossibly long and painful ordeal, even by mythological standards. The ancient sources emphasize this suffering. Leto cried out in pain, clinging to a sacred palm tree that stood on the island. All the goddesses except Hera came to witness the birth, standing in attendance to honor Leto and her children to be. But without Eileithyia, nothing could proceed. Leto remained in agonizing labor, her body racked with contractions that went nowhere, unable to deliver the twins, no matter how hard she tried. Finally, the goddesses took action. They couldn't free Eileithyia directly. She was imprisoned by Hera, and even collectively, the goddesses weren't willing to directly defy the Queen of Heaven. But they could offer a bribe. They sent Iris, the messenger goddess, to Olympus with an enormous necklace of gold and amber, 9 cubits long, to offer Hera in exchange for Eileithyia's freedom. The necklace was so valuable, so beautiful, that even Hera's jealousy couldn't resist. She accepted the bribe and released Eileithyia. The moment Eileithyia arrived on Asteria, the birth could finally proceed. According to most versions, Artemis was born first. She emerged quickly, painlessly, a girl child who seemed already more mature than an infant should be. And immediately, miraculously, the newborn Artemis became a midwife to her own mother, helping Leto deliver her twin brother Apollo. Apollo's birth was the one that had been delayed for 9 days. When he finally emerged, the entire island was transformed. Light blazed across Asteria, not ordinary sunlight, but golden radiance that seemed to emanate from the baby god himself. The barren rock suddenly bloomed with life. Grass and flowers sprang up. Trees grew. The palm tree Leto had clung to became sacred forever after, a symbol of endurance and divine birth. All the assembled goddesses sang a hymn of joy and welcome. The moment Apollo was born, swans circled the island 7 times, a sacred number later reflected in Apollo's 7-stringed lyre. The entire cosmos seemed to acknowledge that something momentous had happened. Zeus looked down from Olympus with pride and satisfaction. His son was born, and what a son he would prove to be. In some versions, Apollo was immediately fed ambrosia and nectar, the food and drink of the gods. This transformed him instantly from infant to youth, not full adult, but adolescent, ready to speak and act and begin his divine work. He spoke to the assembled goddesses, declaring his domains: prophecy, music, archery. He announced what he would become, what he would accomplish. This wasn't the helpless crying of a newborn, but the proud proclamation of a god announcing his arrival. The island Asteria, in gratitude and honor for hosting this miraculous birth, was renamed Delos, meaning visible or clear. It had become visible to all the world, no longer insignificant but sacred. Zeus anchored the island to the ocean floor with 4 diamond pillars, making it stable and permanent. What had been a floating, barren rock became one of the most important religious sites in the ancient Greek world. Temples would be built there. Festivals would be held. Pilgrims would come from across the Mediterranean to honor Apollo at his birthplace. Leto, finally able to rest, nursed her twin children. The ordeal had been terrible, but she had survived, and her children were born healthy and powerful. She had endured Hera's persecution, wandered the world, rejected and pursued, suffered through 9 days of impossible labor, and she had prevailed. The story of Leto's suffering and endurance made her a patron goddess of mothers, especially those facing difficult pregnancies or births. Women in labor would pray to Leto, remembering her ordeal and asking for strength to endure their own. The palm tree on Delos became sacred to Apollo, a symbol of his birth and his mother's endurance. For centuries afterward, a sacred palm tree stood there, or possibly a succession of trees, each replacing the previous one when it died, maintaining the living connection to that first palm Leto had clung to in her pain. Python, the monster that had pursued Leto, didn't immediately die. It retreated to Delphi, where it guarded the oracle that then belonged to Gaia, the earth goddess. But Apollo would remember. The god who had forced his mother to suffer, who had hunted her relentlessly when she was vulnerable and pregnant, would face the newborn god's vengeance soon enough. Apollo, even as a young god, would seek Python out and destroy it. But that story comes next. The birth of Apollo on Delos was more than just a mythological event. It was the foundation story for one of the most important cult sites in ancient Greece. Delos became a pan-Hellenic sanctuary, a place where Greeks from all city-states could come together to worship. Every 4 years, the Delian Games were held there in Apollo's honor, second only to the Olympic Games in importance. The island itself became so sacred that, eventually, it was decreed that no one could be born or die there. Pregnant women had to leave before giving birth, and the dying were transported elsewhere to maintain the island's purity. The story also established important aspects of Apollo's character. He was born of suffering and persecution, his mother hunted and tormented by Hera's jealousy. This origin story perhaps explains some of Apollo's later sympathy for those suffering unjustly, his willingness to intervene on behalf of mortals facing impossible odds. He understood persecution because his mother had endured it. He understood suffering because his birth had been delayed by 9 days of his mother's agony. The twins, Artemis and Apollo, born together on Delos under such dramatic circumstances, remained closely connected throughout mythology. They defended their mother's honor fiercely, protected each other, shared certain attributes. Both were archers, both associated with youth and beauty. Their dual birth, sun and moon, civilization and wilderness, masculine and feminine aspects of divine power, represented a kind of cosmic balance. The transformation of Delos from insignificant floating rock to sacred center of worship also demonstrated divine power. The gods could elevate the lowly, sanctify the profane, transform the worthless into the invaluable. This became a recurring theme in Apollo's mythology, the god who brought light to darkness, order to chaos, meaning to what had been meaningless. Leto's wandering and rejection by all lands also became a story about xenophobia and hospitality. The lands that refused Leto shelter, fearing Hera's wrath more than they valued mercy or compassion, acted wrongly. Only Delos, which had nothing to lose, acted rightly. This became a teaching story. Don't turn away those in need. Don't let fear of powerful enemies override basic decency. Remember that the lowly stranger might be carrying something divine. After the birth, Leto didn't immediately go to Olympus with her children. According to some versions, she stayed on Delos for a time, nursing the twins, recovering from her ordeal. When she eventually traveled to other places, she faced one more challenge. Thirsty and tired, she tried to drink from a spring in Lycia, but local peasants prevented her, stirring mud into the water to make it undrinkable. Leto, exhausted and insulted, transformed them all into frogs, condemning them to live forever in the mud they'd used to deny her water. Even after Apollo's birth, Leto faced disrespect and punished it. The story of Apollo's birth, then, was a story about persecution overcome, suffering endured, the reward of bravery, Delos's bravery in accepting Leto, and the emergence of extraordinary power from difficult circumstances. Apollo wasn't born easily or safely in some divine palace, but came into the world through his mother's suffering on a barren island after 9 days of impossible labor. This origin story mattered to the ancient Greeks. It explained why Delos was sacred. It demonstrated divine justice. Delos was rewarded for mercy. The lands that refused Leto gained nothing. It showed that even gods could suffer, that even the children of Zeus faced hardship before claiming their rightful place. And it introduced Apollo and Artemis as gods, born of tribulation, shaped by their mother's ordeal, destined for greatness precisely because Their beginning had been so difficult. The newborn Apollo, radiant with golden light, would soon begin the work that would make him one of the most important and influential gods in the entire Greek pantheon. But first, he had a monster to kill and an oracle to claim. Python's slaying and the Oracle of Delphi only 4 days after his miraculous birth. Apollo had aged rapidly from infant to youth, a common trait among divine beings. The young god sought out Python, the monstrous serpent that had pursued his mother Leto during her pregnancy. This wasn't a random act of youthful aggression, but a calculated mission of vengeance and a necessary step in establishing Apollo's domain and power. Python was no ordinary serpent. This was a creature of immense size and power, a dragon-like being that had existed since the early days of the cosmos. In some accounts, Python was the child of Gaia, the earth goddess, making it a primordial entity with deep connections to the ancient powers that predated the Olympian gods. The creature had guarded Gaia's oracle at Delphi, a sacred site where the earth goddess spoke prophecies through a priestess, revealing hidden truths and future events. The site that would become Delphi was already sacred before Apollo arrived. It sat on the slopes of Mount Parnassus in central Greece, a dramatic location where two massive rock formations called the Phaedriades, meaning shining ones, rose like gates flanking a sanctuary. Springs of fresh water emerged from the earth. The Greeks believed this place was the Omphalos, the navel or center of the world. According to legend, Zeus had released 2 eagles from opposite ends of the earth, and they met above Delphi, marking it as the world's center point. But Python controlled this sacred place, and the serpent had tormented Apollo's mother at Hera's command. For a god whose domains would include justice, order, and the punishment of wrongdoing, this offense demanded retribution. Python had persecuted a pregnant goddess, had hunted her relentlessly, had tried to prevent the birth of Apollo and Artemis. Such crimes could not go unpunished. Apollo, though only days old in one sense, was already a formidable god. He went to Hephaestus, the divine smith, and requested weapons worthy of his purpose. Hephaestus forged for Apollo a magnificent silver bow and golden arrows, perfect weapons, never missing their mark, imbued with divine power that could slay even an immortal monster. The choice of silver rather than gold for the bow was significant. Silver was associated with the moon, with his sister Artemis with purity and precision. These weren't weapons of brute force, but of accuracy and skill. Armed with his new bow, Apollo traveled to Delphi. He found Python at the Castalian Spring, the sacred water source near the sanctuary. The encounter must have been terrifying. This enormous serpent, coils thick as tree trunks, scales like armor, capable of crushing a man in its coils or tearing him apart with its fangs, faced against a young god who had never fought before. But Apollo was, even then, a master archer. He knocked a golden arrow, drew back the silver bow, and let fly. The arrow struck true. Then another, and another. According to Ovid's account, Apollo shot Python with 1,000 arrows, peppering the creature with so many shafts that its body was covered with them. The monster writhed and fought, but Apollo's arrows were unerring, each one finding a vital spot, each one draining more of Python's strength. Finally, the great serpent collapsed, dead or dying. Apollo's vengeance for his mother was complete. The monster that had terrorized Leto lay defeated at the young god's feet. It was Apollo's first great victory, the event that established him as a powerful deity, worthy of worship and respect. But killing Python created a problem. Python had been Gaia's creature and guardian. By slaying it, Apollo had essentially usurped Gaia's oracle, taken by force what had belonged to the ancient earth goddess. This was a serious transgression, not something to be dismissed lightly even by an Olympian god. Apollo needed to atone for this killing, to purify himself of the pollution that came from such a significant act of violence. Apollo instituted the Pythian Games, athletic and artistic competitions held every 4 years at Delphi, as part of his atonement for killing Python. These games honored the slain serpent while simultaneously celebrating Apollo's victory. Winners were crowned with wreaths made of bay laurel, Apollo's sacred plant, which we'll discuss more when we talk about Daphne, rather than the olive wreaths given at Olympia. The Pythian Games became one of the 4 major Pan-Hellenic games, attracting competitors from across the Greek world. Apollo also had to undergo ritual purification. According to some accounts, he traveled to Tempe in Thessaly, where he was cleansed of Python's blood. The rites involved bathing in sacred waters and performing specific ceremonies to remove the pollution of killing. Only after this purification could Apollo fully assume control of the oracle. Once purified, Apollo established himself at Delphi permanently. He kept Python's body at the site. Some say he let it rot in a chasm beneath the temple. Others that he wrapped the body around a sacred tripod. Either way, Python's presence remained, giving the place its old name Pytho, from the Greek word meaning to rot, and giving Apollo one of his most important epithets, Apollo Pythios, Apollo of Python. The priestess who would channel Apollo's prophecies took her title from the dead serpent. She was called the Pythia, forever linking Apollo's oracle to the creature he had slain. This was significant. Apollo hadn't simply erased Python's legacy, but incorporated it into his own cult. The oracle changed hands, but maintained continuity with its ancient past. The Pythia became the voice of Apollo, the human woman through whom the god spoke his prophecies. She wasn't just any priestess, but a specially chosen woman who, on specific days, would enter an altered state and deliver Apollo's responses to those who came seeking guidance. Let's explore how this process worked, because the Oracle of Delphi became the most important and influential prophetic institution in the ancient Greek world. The Pythia was selected from among the local women of Delphi. In early times, she might have been a young virgin, but after one Pythia was apparently abducted by a lustful visitor, the rules changed. The Pythia was chosen from among older women, typically past childbearing age, who would devote the rest of their lives to Apollo's service. She had to be of good character, morally upright, respected in the community. Once chosen, she would relinquish her previous identity, cease all family obligations, and become purely the Pythia, Apollo's voice on earth. Prophecies were delivered on the 7th day of each month during the 9 warmest months of the year. The 7th day was sacred to Apollo. Tradition said he'd been born on the 7th. During the 3 winter months, Apollo was believed to be away, traveling to the land of the Hyperboreans in the far north, and the oracle was silent. On prophecy days, elaborate rituals preceded the actual consultation. First, a goat was brought to the Castalian spring and doused with cold water. If the goat trembled, This was taken as a sign that Apollo was willing to prophesy that day. If the goat didn't react, the oracle would not operate. This preliminary test ensured that the god was present and willing to speak. Assuming the omens were favorable, those who came seeking prophecy would make offerings, money, animals for sacrifice, precious gifts. Representatives of wealthy city-states or important individuals might offer enormous treasures, building entire treasury houses at Delphi to store their dedications and display their piety. The more you gave, the higher your priority in the queue of petitioners. The Pythia prepared herself through purification rituals. She bathed in the Castalian spring, dressed in special robes, and proceeded to the temple. She would drink from a sacred spring. Accounts differ on which spring, either the Castalian or another source called Cassatus. Possibly eat bay laurel leaves, Apollo's sacred plant, and then descend into the Adyton, the innermost chamber of Apollo's temple, forbidden to all but the Pythia and the priests who attended her. The Adyton contained several sacred objects: the Omphalos stone, which marked Delphi as the world center, a golden statue of Apollo, the sacred tripod on which the Pythia sat, and, according to legend, a chasm in the floor from which vapors emerged. Ancient sources reported that these vapors induced the prophetic trance, though modern archaeological investigations have debated whether such vapors actually existed or were symbolic. Seated on the tripod, the Pythia would enter an altered state. Ancient descriptions vary on exactly what this looked like. Some sources say she became frenzied and ecstatic, speaking gibberish that priests translated into coherent prophecy. Other sources indicate she spoke clearly and intelligibly, delivering prophecies in her own voice while channeled by Apollo. Modern scholars debate this extensively, but what's clear is that the Pythia herself was believed to be possessed or inspired by the god, speaking not her own thoughts, but Apollo's divine knowledge. The prophecies themselves were famously ambiguous. Apollo told the truth, but truth can be tricky. The oracles often featured wordplay, double meanings, and conditional statements that could be interpreted multiple ways. This wasn't deception exactly. Apollo really did reveal true information, but the truth had to be properly understood, and that required wisdom from the recipient. Consider the famous case of King Croesus of Lydia. Around 560 BCE, Croesus was considering whether to attack the Persian Empire. He sent to Delphi asking whether he should go to war. The Pythia responded, "If you cross the Halys River, you will destroy a great empire." Croesus took this as a favorable omen, assuming it meant he would destroy the Persian Empire. He went to war with confidence and was utterly defeated. He had indeed destroyed a great empire, his own. The prophecy was true, but needed proper interpretation. Or consider the Athenians facing Persian invasion in 480 BCE. They consulted Apollo and received a terrifying prophecy telling them to flee, that Athens would be destroyed. Desperate, they asked again for better guidance, and this time the Pythia spoke of a wooden wall that would save them. The Athenians debated what this meant, literal wooden walls around the Acropolis. But Themistocles, the brilliant Athenian leader, interpreted it as meaning their wooden ships, their naval fleet. They evacuated Athens, let the Persians burn the city, and then used their ships to defeat the Persian navy at Salamis. The prophecy was right. The wooden walls, ships, did save them. These ambiguous prophecies served multiple purposes. They protected Apollo's reputation. If things went badly, the prophecy had been misinterpreted, not wrong. They encouraged wisdom and careful thinking from those who consulted the oracle. They left room for human agency and choice in fulfilling or avoiding prophesied outcomes. And they reflected the Greek belief that the future wasn't absolutely fixed, but contained multiple possibilities that mortals influenced through their choices. The influence of the Delphic oracle on Greek history cannot be overstated. Before establishing colonies, Greek city-states consulted Apollo on where to settle. Before major wars, leaders sought his guidance on strategy. Before important political changes, communities asked his approval. The oracle shaped policy decisions, territorial expansions, legal reforms, religious practices. When the Pythia spoke, people listened. Kings, generals, commoners, entire city-states. The Temple of Delphi became incredibly wealthy from all these consultations and dedications. Various Greek city-states built treasuries there to house their offerings. The sanctuary was filled with statues, monuments, precious dedications. The Siphnian treasury, the Athenian treasury, and numerous other buildings showcased the architectural and artistic accomplishments of different cities while demonstrating their devotion to Apollo. The Pythian Games, held every 4 years, featured not just athletic competitions like the Olympics, but also musical and artistic contests appropriate for Apollo as god of music and arts. Competitions in lyre playing, singing, poetry, and drama took place alongside foot races, chariot races, and other athletic events. Winners gained tremendous prestige, and their victories were celebrated throughout Greece. Apollo's conquest of Delphi, his slaying of Python, and his establishment of the oracle represented more than just mythological drama. They symbolized the transition from an older order to the new Olympian regime. Gaia's earth-centered prophecy gave way to Apollo's celestial wisdom. The chthonic powers of the deep earth were superseded by Olympian authority. Yet Apollo honored what came before, kept Python's name in the Pythia's title, maintained the ancient sacredness of the site, while claiming it for the new order. The oracle operated for nearly 1,000 years, from the 8th century BCE until the late 4th century CE, when the Roman Emperor Theodosius ordered the closure of all pagan sanctuaries. For all those centuries, the Pythia sat on her tripod, entered her trance, and spoke Apollo's truths to a waiting world. Kings rose and fell based on her prophecies. Colonies were founded where she directed. Wars were fought based on her cryptic advice. Laws were changed according to her guidance. The Oracle of Delphi was Apollo's greatest gift to humanity: access to divine knowledge, the ability to consult a god directly about pressing concerns, guidance in navigating an uncertain future. Yes, the prophecies were ambiguous and required interpretation. Yes, mistakes were made and tragedies occurred. But the very existence of the oracle demonstrated that the gods cared about human affairs, that they were willing to offer counsel, that divine wisdom was accessible to those wise enough to seek it and interpret it correctly. Apollo's slaying of Python and conquest of Delphi was the foundational act of his divine career. It avenged his mother, established his power, gave him a permanent home and cult center, and provided humanity with the most important prophetic institution of the ancient world. The young god who had slain the serpent with 1,000 arrows became Apollo Pythios, Lord of Prophecy, the god whose truth illuminated the future. as surely as the sun illuminated the day. The lyre, music, and the muses. If prophecy was Apollo's most important gift to humanity, and slaying Python was his greatest martial achievement, then music was his most personal domain, the art form that expressed his very essence, the creative force that brought harmony to both the divine and mortal realms. Apollo was the god of music, the divine musician whose lyre could make even the Olympians pause to listen, whose songs expressed beauty so pure it seemed to make the cosmos itself more orderly. The lyre, that stringed instrument, somewhat like a small harp, with a wooden frame and 7 strings, traditionally made from sheep gut, became Apollo's most recognizable symbol after his silver bow. But how did Apollo acquire this instrument? The story involves trickery, brotherly negotiation, and ultimately, divine artistry elevated to perfection, according to the most famous version, told in the Homeric hymn to Hermes. The lyre was actually invented by Apollo's half-brother Hermes. On the very day of his birth, Hermes was also precocious, mature from infancy like Apollo. The trickster god found a tortoise. Rather than treating it as a pet, the clever infant Hermes killed it, scooped out its shell, and used the hollow shell as a resonating chamber. He stretched strings across it, creating the first lyre. But Hermes didn't stop with invention. That same day, the newborn god stole Apollo's cattle. Yes, cattle, because Apollo wasn't just a god of arts and prophecy, but also protected herdsmen and flocks. Hermes was clever about it, making the cattle walk backward so their tracks would be confusing and disguising his own infant footprints. He drove the stolen herd far away and hid them. When Apollo discovered his cattle missing and tracked them to baby Hermes, he was furious. The confrontation between the two gods is wonderfully told in the hymn. Hermes playing innocent, Apollo not believing him for a moment, both of them bringing their case before Zeus. Zeus, trying not to laugh at his infant son's audacity, ordered Hermes to return the cattle, but as Hermes complied, he began playing the lyre he'd invented, and Apollo stopped dead. The sound was extraordinary. Nothing Apollo had heard before. The music from this tortoiseshell instrument was beautiful, compelling, perfect. Apollo had to have it. He would trade anything, even his cattle, for this lyre that produced such miraculous sounds. Hermes, recognizing Apollo's desire and seeing an opportunity, negotiated. He would give Apollo the lyre in exchange for keeping the cattle and perhaps also for certain divine privileges, depending on the version. Apollo agreed eagerly, and thus the lyre passed from Hermes to Apollo, where it truly belonged. Once Apollo possessed the lyre, he mastered it completely. The god practiced constantly, developing techniques and skills that no mortal could match. He tuned it perfectly, discovering the mathematical relationships between string lengths and musical intervals that created harmony. Apollo understood that music was mathematical, that it reflected cosmic order, that the same proportions that govern the movement of celestial bodies also govern the relationships between musical notes. This understanding that music reflected cosmic harmony was fundamental to how the Greeks thought about Apollo and music. They believed the universe operated according to mathematical principles, that the movements of planets and stars created what they called the music of the spheres. Inaudible to human ears, but real nonetheless. Apollo's music echoed this cosmic music, bringing divine orders and harmony into audible form. Apollo's lyre had 7 strings, corresponding to the 7 planets known to the ancient Greeks, including the sun and moon. Each string, when properly tuned, represented one of these celestial bodies. Playing the lyre wasn't just making pretty sounds, but participating in and expressing the fundamental mathematical relationships that govern the cosmos. Apollo became leader of the Muses, the 9 goddesses who inspired all creative endeavor. The Muses were daughters of Zeus and Mnemosyne, memory, each associated with a particular art or science. Calliope, epic poetry; Clio, history; Erato, love poetry; Euterpe, music and elegiac poetry; Melpomene, tragedy; Polyhymnia, hymns; Terpsichore, dance; Thalia, comedy; and Urania, astronomy. These goddesses dwelt on Mount Parnassus near Delphi and on Mount Helicon in Boeotia. As Apollo Musaget's, Apollo the Muse leader, he directed their songs and dances. The Muses would sing while Apollo played his lyre, creating music of such beauty that the other Olympians would stop whatever they were doing to listen. At divine banquets on Olympus, Apollo would play and the Muses would sing, providing entertainment that made the feasts of gods glorious beyond mortal imagining. But Apollo didn't just perform for divine audiences. He taught music to talented mortals, sponsored competitions, and inspired poets and musicians. The greatest lyric poets, including Pindar, invoked Apollo and the Muses at the beginning of their works, asking for divine inspiration. Epic poets did the same. The Iliad and Odyssey both begin with invocations to the Muse, asking her to speak through the poet. This concept that artistic creation required divine inspiration, that the Muses literally breathed creativity into mortal minds, was fundamental to Greek understanding of how art worked. You couldn't just decide to write great poetry through skill and training alone. You needed the Muses' gift, Apollo's favor, divine inspiration that elevated mortal craft into true art. Apollo also represented music as education and civilization. Music wasn't just entertainment, but a fundamental part of Greek education. Young men learned to play the lyre as part of their cultural training. Music taught proportion, harmony, mathematical relationships, self-control. You had to practice diligently to master an instrument. Apollo, as divine musician, embodied all these values: discipline, education, mathematical knowledge, beauty expressed through order. But Apollo's musical supremacy was challenged twice, and both challenges revealed the god's capacity for terrible vengeance when his art was questioned or his skill doubted. The first challenge came from Marsyas, a satyr who found a flute that Athena had invented and then discarded. Athena had thrown the flute away because playing it made her cheeks puff out unattractively. But Marsyas picked it up, learned to play it, and became skilled enough that he foolishly challenged Apollo to a musical contest. Apollo agreed to the contest, but set terrible terms. The winner could do whatever he wanted to the loser. They performed before the Muses as judges. Marsyas played his flute brilliantly. The double-piped aulos was a powerful instrument capable of complex melodies. But then Apollo played his lyre, and simultaneously he sang, adding his divine voice to the instrument's beauty. He challenged Marsyas to do the same, play and sing at once. But the flute, blown through the mouth, made singing impossible. Marsyas couldn't match Apollo's combined musical expression. The Muses judged Apollo the winner, and Apollo, angry that a mere satyr had dared challenge a god, exacted his terrible revenge. he tied Marsyas to a tree and flayed him alive, peeling off his skin while the satyr screamed. This horrific punishment was meant to demonstrate that mortals and immortals weren't equal, that hubris, challenging the gods, brought terrible consequences, that Apollo's musical supremacy wasn't merely skill, but divine perfection that shouldn't be questioned. The second challenge, somewhat less known, but equally instructive, came from King Midas of Phrygia. Midas was present at a musical contest between Apollo and Pan, the rustic god of shepherds who played the panpipes. Apollo won, obviously. His music was divine, while Pan's was merely exceptional. Everyone acknowledged Apollo's superiority except Midas, who said he preferred Pan's music. Apollo, offended that Midas couldn't appreciate divine music, punished him by giving him donkey's ears, a permanent mark of his poor judgment and musical ignorance. These stories about Apollo punishing musical challengers might seem cruel to modern sensibilities, but they embodied important Greek ideas about artistic judgment and divine authority. Art wasn't subjective in the Greek view. There was genuine excellence, real beauty, that reflected cosmic order, and divine music truly was superior to mortal music. To claim otherwise wasn't expressing an opinion, but demonstrating ignorance or hubris. Apollo's music also had practical applications. Paeans, hymns sung to Apollo, could avert evil, heal the sick, celebrate victories, or give thanks. These weren't just songs, but powerful utterances that invoked Apollo's beneficent power. During plague, the Greeks would sing paeans to Apollo, asking him to lift the disease. After battle victories, paeans of thanksgiving acknowledged Apollo's support. The music itself was believed to have power, not magic exactly, but genuine effect on the world, reflecting the divine harmony Apollo represented. In warfare, Greek soldiers sang paeans as they advanced into battle, calling on Apollo to strengthen their courage and guide their strikes. The rhythm of the paean helped them march in formation. The invocation of Apollo's name reminded them they fought with divine support. Music in Apollo's domain wasn't separate from practical life, but integral to success in many endeavors. Apollo's lyre appears in countless artistic representations, on pottery, in sculpture, in literature. The god is almost always shown young and beautiful, holding or playing his lyre, sometimes crowned with laurel. This image, Apollo the beautiful musician, forever young, creating perfect harmony, became one of the most iconic in all of ancient art. The lyre also symbolized education and culture. When Greeks wanted to contrast themselves with barbarians, non-Greeks, they might point to music, poetry, and artistic achievement as marks of Hellenic civilization. Apollo, as divine musician and muse leader, embodied this civilized culture. To worship Apollo was to value art, music, poetry, education, all the things that elevated humans above mere survival. Apollo's music was also connected to healing. Sound and harmony could soothe troubled minds, ease pain, restore balance to disordered bodies. Music therapy wasn't a modern invention, but an ancient practice grounded in the Greek understanding that harmony in sound reflected and could restore harmony in body and soul. Apollo, as god of both music and healing, wasn't holding two unrelated domains, but expressing a unified understanding of harmony's power. The mathematical relationships in music, the ratios between string lengths that produced consonant intervals, fascinated Greek philosophers and mathematicians. Pythagoras, the mathematician and philosopher, was obsessed with these relationships and developed theories about how mathematical principles governed both music and the cosmos. This Pythagorean tradition saw Apollo's music as the audible expression of mathematical truth, evidence that the universe operated according to rational, comprehensible principles. In festivals throughout Greece, musical competitions honored Apollo. The Pythian Games featured contests in lyre playing and singing. Winners gained tremendous prestige, not just as skilled musicians, but as Apollo's favorite ones, people the god had inspired with exceptional gifts. These contests encouraged musical development, spread performance techniques, and elevated music status in Greek culture. Apollo also taught specific individuals. Orpheus, the legendary musician, whose songs could move stones and trees, was said to be Apollo's son, or at least a particular favorite. Orpheus's lyre came from Apollo, and his skill reflected divine teaching. When Orpheus descended to the underworld to retrieve his dead wife Eurydice, it was his music, Apollo's gift, that moved Hades and Persephone to let him try. The god's music could also prophesy. Sometimes the Pythia at Delphi would deliver prophecies in verse, structured in dactylic hexameter. This poetic prophecy demonstrated Apollo's dual nature as god of both music and prophecy. His truths came in beautiful, rhythmic form, combining artistic expression with divine revelation. Apollo's lyre, his leadership of the muses, his musical victories and vengeful punishments, all contributed to his status as the god who brought order through art, harmony through sound, civilization through music. His seven-stringed lyre echoed the seven planets. His songs reflected cosmic order. His teaching elevated human culture. Apollo the musician was Apollo the civilizer, the god who made mortals more than animals, by teaching them to create beauty, to appreciate harmony, to understand that mathematics and music and cosmic order were all expressions of the same divine truth. Every time a Greek student practiced his lyre, every time a poet invoked the muses, every time a paean was sung, Apollo's influence manifested. The god of the silver bow was also the god of the seven strings, and his music, perfect, mathematical, beautiful, divine, shaped Greek culture as profoundly as his prophecies shaped Greek history. Apollo's tragic loves, Daphne and the laurel, for all his beauty, accomplishment, and divine power. Apollo was remarkably unlucky in love, the god who could shoot arrows with perfect accuracy, who played the lyre with unmatched skill, who spoke prophecies that shaped the future. This same god experienced rejection, loss, and tragedy in nearly every romantic pursuit. His loves almost always ended badly, and the stories of these failed romances reveal as much about Apollo's character as his triumphs do. The most famous of Apollo's tragic loves is Daphne, a beautiful nymph whose story explains why the laurel tree became Apollo's sacred plant, and why laurel wreaths crown victors and poets. This tale begins not with love, but with mockery and divine revenge, a pattern that would define many of Apollo's romantic disasters. Fresh from his victory over Python, young Apollo was feeling confident, perhaps overly so. He encountered Eros, known as Cupid in Roman mythology, the god of love who was stringing his little bow. Apollo, flushed with his own success as an archer, made a terrible mistake. He mocked Eros's archery. "What are you doing with a warrior's weapons, wanton boy?" Apollo taunted. "That bow is suited to my shoulders, since I can strike down dangerous beasts and slay my enemies with perfect aim." I just killed Python with countless arrows. You should stick to kindling whatever passions you kindle with your little torch, not claim the glory of archery. This was hubris, excessive pride, insulting a god, suggesting that Eros's power was lesser than Apollo's martial skill. Eros, though often depicted as a chubby infant, was actually an ancient and powerful deity. His powers governed one of the most fundamental forces in existence: desire, attraction, love. To mock Eros was to invite disaster. Eros smiled, not a friendly smile, but the smile of someone planning revenge. Your arrows may strike all things, Apollo, he said, but my arrows will strike you, as much as all creatures are less than gods. So much is your glory less than mine. Then Eros took 2 arrows from his quiver. One arrow had a gold tip that kindled love in anyone struck by it. Instant, overwhelming, uncontrollable love. The other arrow had a leaden tip that did the opposite, creating instant aversion, making love impossible, filling the struck person with disgust at the very thought of romantic attachment. Eros shot Apollo with a golden arrow. The effect was immediate and devastating. Apollo fell madly, obsessively in love. But with whom? Eros wanted this to hurt, wanted Apollo to suffer the way the god had made Eros's work seem trivial. So Eros aimed his leaden arrow carefully at a beautiful nymph named Daphne. Daphne was a daughter of the river god Peneus in Thessaly, though some versions make her daughter of the river Ladon in Arcadia. She loved the wilderness and hunting, much like the goddess Artemis. She had no interest in marriage or romantic love. She wanted to remain free, independent, a virgin devoted to the forests and mountains. She had rejected every suitor who'd approached her, preferring solitude and the hunt to any relationship. The moment Eros's leaden arrow struck Daphne, she became even more committed to this independence. The very idea of love, especially Apollo's love, became repulsive to her. She would flee from Apollo not just because she preferred independence, but because his pursuit filled her with genuine horror and disgust. Apollo, struck with the golden arrow, saw Daphne and was consumed with desire. He didn't just admire her. He needed her, wanted her, had to possess her. All his divine wisdom, all his prophetic knowledge, none of it helped. He was reduced to a lovesick pursuer, unable to think clearly, seeing only the object of his obsession. Apollo approached Daphne and tried to woo her with words. He praised her beauty, her hair like sunlight, her eyes like stars, her form more perfect than any goddess's. He listed his accomplishments. He was the son of Zeus. He ruled Delphi. He commanded prophecy. Surely such a god was a worthy match for any nymph. He promised her everything: status, comfort, divine protection. If she would only stop, only listen, only give him a chance, she would see that his love was glorious, that being loved by Apollo was an honor beyond measure. But Daphne didn't want any of this. She didn't want Apollo's love, or his gifts, or his divine status. She wanted to be left alone. She told him no, clearly, firmly, repeatedly. She tried to explain that she had vowed to remain a virgin, that she didn't want marriage or romance, that he needed to leave her alone. Apollo, blinded by Eros's golden arrow, and perhaps by his own arrogance, didn't listen. He convinced himself that Daphne's rejection was shyness, that she didn't understand how wonderful his love would be, that if he pursued her more ardently, she would eventually yield. This delusion is chilling in its familiarity. The lover who won't accept no who believes his persistence will overcome resistance, who can't see that he's terrorizing rather than wooing. Daphne ran. Apollo chased. She fled through forests and meadows, across hills and streams, desperate to escape. Apollo followed relentlessly, calling out to her, begging her to stop, promising he wouldn't hurt her, insisting he only wanted to love her. But his pursuit was itself a harm, a violation of her expressed wishes, a refusal to respect her autonomy. Daphne was swift, but Apollo was a god. Despite her speed and knowledge of the forest paths, despite her desperate terror lending her strength, Apollo gained on her. His hand reached out, almost touching her. She could feel his breath on her neck. There was no escape through speed. She was about to be caught. In absolute desperation, Daphne cried out to her father, "Help me, father. If your streams have any power, change me. Destroy this beauty that pulses too well." She would rather cease to exist as herself than be caught by Apollo. She would rather be anything than the object of his obsessive pursuit. Peneus heard his daughter's plea. River gods had power over transformation, over the boundaries between forms. In the instant before Apollo's hand closed on Daphne's shoulder, the transformation began. Heaviness spread through her limbs. Thin bark closed over her breasts. Her hair became leaves. Her arms stretched into branches. Her feet, so swift a moment ago, became roots driving deep into the earth. Her face and head formed the crown of a laurel tree. Apollo reached her just as the transformation completed. Instead of embracing a nymph, he embraced a tree. He touched the trunk and felt the heart still beating beneath the bark. Daphne was still there, in some sense, trapped or transformed or escaped into this new form. He embraced the branches and kissed the wood. But even as a tree, the branches seemed to shrink from his kisses, rejecting him still. Apollo mourned. Despite everything, despite his obsessive pursuit, driving Daphne to this desperate escape, he still claimed to love her. "Since you cannot be my wife," he declared, "you shall be my tree. Laurel, I will wear you on my head. I will wrap you around my lyre and my quiver. You will adorn Roman generals in their triumphs. You will crown the heads of winners and poets. And as eternal youth is mine, you too shall be evergreen, your leaves never falling." Apollo made the laurel tree sacred to himself. From that day forward, he wore a laurel wreath on his head. Victors in athletic competitions were crowned with laurel. Poets were crowned with laurel. Roman generals celebrating triumphs wore laurel wreaths. Apollo used his divine power to make Daphne's laurel form eternally green. Her leaves would never wither or fall, just as Apollo's beauty never aged. On one level, this seems romantic. Apollo honoring his lost love by making her tree sacred, by wearing her leaves forever, by ensuring she's associated with victory and achievement. But on another level, it's disturbing. Daphne didn't want Apollo's love. She didn't choose this transformation as a romantic gesture, but as an escape from his unwanted pursuit. She literally preferred to stop being human rather than be caught by him. And Apollo's response was to claim her anyway, to make her transformation about him, to turn her escape into his eternal symbol. The story of Apollo and Daphne became one of the most frequently depicted myths in Western art. Bernini's famous sculpture captures the moment of transformation. Daphne's fingers sprouting leaves, her legs rooting in the ground, her expression showing terror and change, while Apollo reaches for her, his face showing desire and surprise. Artists loved this scene because it showed transformation in progress, allowed them to demonstrate skill in depicting both human and botanical forms simultaneously. But modern readers often see this myth differently than ancient audiences might have. To us, it's a story about consent violated, about a woman driven to desperate measures to escape harassment, about a powerful man refusing to accept no as an answer. Daphne explicitly rejected Apollo. She ran from him. She begged for divine intervention to escape him. Every action she took said no. But Apollo pursued anyway. The ancient Greeks might have seen it differently, as a tragedy where Eros's revenge ruined what could have been a beautiful relationship, where Apollo's genuine, if magically induced, love was thwarted by circumstance, where both Apollo and Daphne were victims of divine manipulation. They might have viewed Apollo's persistence as admirably passionate rather than inappropriately aggressive. They might have seen Daphne's transformation as sad, but also as creating something beautiful, the sacred laurel that would crown victors and poets. Both readings exist in the myth. Apollo genuinely did grieve losing Daphne. His love, though induced by Eros's arrow, seemed real to him. His honoring of the laurel tree wasn't purely possessive, but carried genuine reverence. Yet, Daphne's terror was also real. Her rejection was clear, and her transformation was an escape, not a romantic gesture. The laurel became central to Apollo's worship and Greek culture more broadly. Pythia, Apollo's priestess at Delphi, chewed laurel leaves before delivering her prophecies. The leaves supposedly had mild psychoactive properties that might have contributed to her trance state. Laurel wreaths crowned winners at the Pythian Games and in other competitions. Poets were called laureates, laurel wearers. Generals celebrated triumphs wearing laurel. The plant that was Daphne's escape became a symbol of achievement, victory, and divine favor. Some interpret the myth as explaining why the laurel was already sacred to Apollo. Daphne became associated with Apollo's plant, rather than the plant being created from her transformation. Either way, the laurel and Apollo became inextricably linked, and every laurel wreath placed on a victor's head carried echoes of this tragedy, this pursuit, this transformation. The Daphne story also established a pattern for Apollo's other romantic pursuits. They almost all ended badly, whether because of Eros's revenge, Apollo's own character flaws, or simply divine bad luck. The god of light and prophecy seemed cursed in love. His next major romance, with the beautiful youth Hyacinthus, would end in accidental death. His affair with Coronis would end in her death, and the birth of his son Asclepius from her corpse. His attempted relationship with Cassandra would result in the cursing of her prophetic gift. Apollo, for all his divine power and accomplishments, could not succeed in love. The god who could see the future through prophecy somehow couldn't foresee or prevent the tragedies that befell those he loved. The god whose arrows never missed their mark in warfare couldn't hit the mark in romance. The god who created perfect harmony through music couldn't create harmony in relationships. This vulnerability made Apollo more relatable to mortal worshippers. Even gods suffered in love. Even divine beauty and power didn't guarantee happiness in romance. Even perfect prophetic knowledge couldn't prevent heartbreak. Apollo's romantic tragedies humanized him, made him accessible, showed that the gap between gods and mortals wasn't absolute. If Apollo could grieve lost love, then mortals grieving their own losses were participating in something divine, something even gods experienced. The laurel tree, eternally green, forever sacred to Apollo, stood as a permanent reminder of the god's most famous romantic tragedy. Every time Apollo wore his laurel crown, every time a victor was crowned with laurel leaves, every time the Pythia chewed laurel before prophesying, Daphne was remembered, the nymph who preferred transformation over submission, who chose to become a tree rather than become Apollo's love, whose desperate prayer was answered by her father, giving her an escape that no amount of divine power could prevent. More loves and vengeance, Hyacinthus, Coronis, Cassandra. Apollo's romantic tragedies didn't end with Daphne. If anything, the Daphne story was just the beginning of a pattern of loss, death, and sorrow that seemed to follow the god of light wherever his affections led him. Let's explore several other significant loves in Apollo's mythology, each revealing different aspects of his character and each ending in ways that added to the god's legacy and the symbols associated with him. Hyacinthus was a beautiful Spartan prince, a youth so handsome that he caught the attention of several gods and mortals alike. Apollo fell deeply in love with him, a genuine love, not magically induced, like his obsession with Daphne. The two became close companions. Apollo would visit the mortal youth regularly, and they would spend time together, engaged in various athletic pursuits, including discus throwing, wrestling, and archery. Hyacinthus returned Apollo's affection. Unlike Daphne, he didn't flee or reject the god, but welcomed the relationship. For once, Apollo found someone who loved him back, who enjoyed his company, who chose to be with him freely. It must have seemed like Apollo had finally found happiness in love, that his curse of romantic tragedy had been broken. But tragedy struck anyway, emerging from an unexpected source. The west wind, Zephyrus, was also in love with Hyacinthus, and deeply jealous of Apollo's relationship with the youth. One day, when Apollo and Hyacinthus were practicing discus throwing, Zephyrus saw his opportunity for revenge. Apollo threw the discus with tremendous force, not trying to harm anyone, just displaying his strength and skill, turning athletics into a kind of showing off for his beloved. The heavy bronze discus flew far through the air. Hyacinthus, eager to impress Apollo with his own strength and stamina, ran forward to catch or retrieve the discus, wanting to show that he could handle the heavy disc that the god had thrown. But Zephyrus, in his jealousy, blew a gust of wind that altered the discus's trajectory. The heavy bronze disc that should have landed harmlessly struck Hyacinthus in the head. The impact was devastating. Hyacinthus collapsed, blood pouring from the terrible wound. Apollo ran to him, desperately trying to save him. The god who had knowledge of medicine, who could heal diseases and cure wounds, tried every technique he knew. He applied herbs, spoke healing incantations, used all his divine knowledge to stop the bleeding, to reverse the damage. But nothing worked. The wound was mortal, and even a god's love and skill couldn't change that. Sometimes, even in mythology, death was absolute. Hyacinthus died in Apollo's arms. The god mourned intensely, not just sadness, but devastating grief. Here was someone who'd loved him back, who'd chosen to be with him, who'd brought him genuine happiness, and now Hyacinthus was gone, killed by an accident that wasn't really an accident. taken by jealous intervention. Apollo couldn't bear for Hyacinthus to simply vanish into death. He used his divine power to transform the youth's blood into a flower. From the ground where Hyacinthus's blood fell, a beautiful flower grew. The hyacinth, with petals that some said bore markings resembling the Greek letters AI, meaning alas, alas, a permanent expression of Apollo's grief. The hyacinth became sacred to Apollo, just as the laurel had. But where the laurel represented unattainable love rejected, the hyacinth represented love reciprocated but lost, happiness briefly grasped and then destroyed by forces beyond control. Annual festivals called Hyacinthiae were held in Sparta in memory of the beautiful youth, combining mourning for his death with celebration of his life and Apollo's love for him. Apollo's grief over Hyacinthus appears in various ancient texts. Lucian, the Roman satirist, has Apollo list Hyacinthus and Daphne as his two greatest loves and lament losing them both. The story became a popular subject for poets, exploring themes of beautiful youth cut short, of divine love unable to prevent mortal death, of grief that transforms into eternal remembrance through flowers and festivals. Another tragic love was Coronis, a mortal princess from Thessaly. Apollo fell in love with her, and she became pregnant with his child. For a time, this relationship seemed to be going well. Coronis was carrying Apollo's son, who would become Asclepius, the greatest healer in Greek mythology. Apollo was pleased, anticipating fatherhood, looking forward to this child who would inherit his healing knowledge. But Coronis made a terrible mistake. While pregnant with Apollo's child, she had an affair with a mortal man named Ischys. Perhaps she preferred mortals to gods, or perhaps she was frightened of giving birth to a divine child, or perhaps she simply fell in love with Ischys. Whatever her reasons, she betrayed Apollo's trust. Apollo, as god of prophecy, could foresee future events. But interestingly, different versions of the myth differ on how he discovered Coronis's betrayal. In some versions, he simply knew through his prophetic powers. In others, a white raven, or crow, that Apollo had left to watch over Coronis flew to him and reported her infidelity. This version adds an interesting detail. In reward for bringing this news, Apollo cursed the raven, turning its white feathers black. Apollo didn't want messengers bringing him such terrible news, even when the news was true. The raven's punishment reflected Apollo's rage and pain. The messenger suffered for the message. However he learned of it, Apollo was furious. His reaction to betrayal was swift and terrible. He shot Coronis with his silver arrows, killing her. Only after she was dead, only when it was too late to undo what he'd done, did Apollo apparently regret his rashness. Coronis had betrayed him, yes, but she'd also been carrying his child. In killing her, he'd killed his unborn son as well. Coronis was placed on her funeral pyre, ready to be cremated. As the flames began to consume her body, Apollo rushed forward and, in one of mythology's more grotesque moments, cut the unborn child from her womb. He rescued Asclepius from the burning corpse of his mother, saving his son even though he'd killed the mother in his rage. Apollo gave Asclepius to the centaur Chiron to raise and educate. Chiron was a wise and gentle centaur, unlike most of his kind, known for educating heroes. Under Chiron's tutelage, Asclepius learned medicine and healing. Apollo also taught his son directly, passing on his own medical knowledge. Asclepius eventually became the greatest healer ever known, able to cure any disease, set any broken bone, even, according to some accounts, raise the dead. This last ability proved problematic. When Asclepius resurrected someone who died, different versions named different people. Sometimes it was Hippolytus, sometimes others. Hades, the god of the underworld, complained to Zeus. If mortals could be resurrected, death lost its meaning. The natural order was disrupted. Zeus, agreeing this was a problem, struck Asclepius down with a thunderbolt, killing Apollo's son. Apollo's reaction was intense rage directed at Zeus. He couldn't attack his father directly. Zeus was too powerful. But he could and did kill the Cyclopes who forged Zeus's thunderbolts, making it impossible, temporarily, for Zeus to create new ones. This was a serious offense, attacking the Cyclopes who served Zeus, essentially disarming the king of gods. Zeus punished Apollo by forcing him to serve a mortal for a year as a shepherd. Apollo served King Admetus of Pherae, tending his flocks with humility. This period of servitude humanized Apollo somewhat. The god experienced what it meant to be powerless, to serve rather than be served, to labor as mortals labored. The Coronis story has layers of tragedy. Apollo's initial love, Coronis's betrayal, Apollo's murderous rage, his regret coming too late. Asclepius rescued but orphaned. Asclepius's development into a great healer, inheriting Apollo's own skills. Asclepius overreaching and being struck down. Apollo's vengeance bringing further punishment on himself. It's a cascade of mistakes, violence, and grief that shows Apollo at his worst. Jealous, violent, acting impulsively out of rage, but also at his most human, experiencing betrayal and responding with emotions rather than wisdom. Cassandra's story involves a different kind of tragedy. Not death, but a curse that made truth itself a burden. Cassandra was a princess of Troy, daughter of King Priam, beautiful and intelligent. Apollo desired her and offered her a gift to win her affection, the power of prophecy. He would teach her to see the future, to speak truths about what was to come. It was an extraordinary gift, one of Apollo's most important powers, offered to win a mortal woman's love. Cassandra accepted the gift. Apollo taught her prophecy, gave her the ability to see future events clearly and truly. But once she had this power, Cassandra refused Apollo's advances. She'd taken the gift, but wouldn't give him what he wanted in return. This was a kind of deception, accepting Apollo's gift under implied agreement, then refusing to fulfill her end of the bargain. Apollo couldn't take back the gift. Divine gifts, once given, couldn't be revoked. But he could corrupt it, twist it, make it a burden rather than a blessing. He cursed Cassandra in a specific and terrible way. She would retain her prophetic power, would continue to see the future truly and clearly, but no one would ever believe her. She could speak truth, warn of coming disasters, predict tragedy, and everyone would dismiss her words as madness. This curse made Cassandra's life a special kind of hell. She saw the future catastrophes approaching Troy. She warned that Paris's journey to Sparta would bring disaster. She saw that the Trojan War would end with Troy's destruction. She knew when the Greeks left the wooden horse outside the city gates that it was a trick, that Greek warriors hid inside, that bringing it into the city would doom them all. She spoke, made all those truths clearly and desperately, and no one listened. Everyone dismissed her as crazy, hysterical, delusional. Imagine knowing with absolute certainty that disaster was approaching, being able to see exactly how it would unfold, warning everyone who could prevent it, and having every warning ignored. Cassandra had to watch every prophecy come true, knowing she had tried to prevent it, knowing no one would ever believe her warnings. It was a perfect curse from Apollo's perspective. She kept the gift, but found it worthless, kept the power, but found it useless, experienced divine vision, but gained nothing but suffering from it. The curse of Cassandra also reflected something about Apollo and prophecy more generally. Prophecies were often cryptic and required interpretation. Cassandra's curse made her prophecies not cryptic, but simply unbelievable, the truth spoken plainly, dismissed as lies. This might represent how difficult it was for mortals to accept unwelcome truths, even when clearly stated. People didn't want to believe that Troy would fall, so they didn't believe Cassandra when she said so. Apollo's curse made explicit what was often already implicit, that truth-telling wasn't enough, that being right didn't mean being heard. After Troy fell exactly as Cassandra had predicted, she was taken as a slave by Agamemnon, the Greek commander. She returned with him to Mycenae, where she predicted, correctly and uselessly, that Agamemnon's wife Clytemnestra was going to murder him and anyone with him. Agamemnon didn't believe her. Clytemnestra killed them both. Even at her death, Cassandra's curse held. She saw her own murder coming, warned about it, and no one listened. Other romantic tragedies appear in Apollo's mythology, though some are less well known. He loved Cyrene, a fierce huntress, and carried her off to Libya, where he founded a city named after her. He loved the Sibyl of Cumae, offering her as many years of life as grains of sand she could hold. But she forgot to ask for eternal youth, so she aged perpetually, eventually becoming so ancient and shriveled that she lived in a jar, begging to die. He loved the nymph Sinop, who tricked him by asking for one wish before yielding to him, then wishing to remain a virgin forever, thus escaping him through clever wordplay. The pattern is clear. Apollo, the most beautiful of gods, the master of prophecy who could see the future, repeatedly failed in love. His loves ended in death, transformation, curse, or escape, where other gods might have many successful romances producing numerous divine children without tragedy. Apollo's relationships were marked by loss and sorrow. This pattern made Apollo a complex and compelling figure. He wasn't just powerful and beautiful, but also vulnerable, capable of suffering, marked by tragedies that even his divine status couldn't prevent or fix. His loves humanized him, made him relatable, showed that even gods experience pain and loss in profoundly personal ways. The flowers and festivals that resulted from these tragedies, the laurel for Daphne, the hyacinth for Hyacinthus, the continued prophecy reflecting Cassandra's curse, kept these stories alive in Greek consciousness. Every laurel wreath, every hyacinth bloom, every unbelieved warning carried echoes of Apollo's loves and losses. The god of light cast shadows in love, and those shadows were as much a part of his mythology as his triumphs and achievements. Apollo the archer, vengeance and justice. Beyond music, prophecy, and tragic romance, Apollo was a deadly archer whose silver bow struck with divine precision. His epithet, Hekaergos, the far shooter, emphasized his ability to kill from vast distances with arrows that never missed. Where his lyre brought harmony and beauty, his bow brought death and justice. Apollo as archer represented divine punishment, the enforcement of cosmic order. the terrible consequences of hubris and offense against the gods. Apollo's silver bow was forged by Hephaestus, the divine smith, specifically to kill Python. After that first great victory, the bow remained Apollo's weapon of choice. His golden arrows could strike down individuals or spread plague across entire populations. When Apollo drew his bow, death followed inevitably. There was no dodging, no armor that could protect, no healing that could cure wounds from the divine arrows. The most famous demonstration of Apollo's archery as an instrument of vengeance is the story of Niobe, Queen of Thebes. Niobe had 14 children, 7 sons and 7 daughters. Some accounts vary the number. She was proud of her children, as any mother might be, but her pride crossed the line into hubris. She began to boast that she was superior to the goddess Leto, who had only 2 children, Apollo and Artemis. "Why do you worship Leto?" Niobe asked the Theban women. "What has she done to deserve such honor? I have given birth to 7 sons and 7 daughters. I am far more blessed than Leto with her paltry 2 children. I am like the gods in my fertility. Even if death took some of my children, I would still have more than Leto ever bore." This was monumentally foolish. Niobe was directly insulting a goddess, claiming superiority based on quantity of offspring, treating divine children as less valuable than mortal ones. She was demonstrating exactly the kind of excessive pride that the Greeks called hubris, forgetting her mortal status, comparing herself favorably to an immortal, disrespecting the divine. Word of Niobe's boasting reached Leto. The goddess was understandably offended. She had suffered terribly to give birth to her twins, pursued by Hera's jealousy, hunted by Python, wandering homeless, enduring 9 days of impossible labor. Her children were Olympian gods, powerful and important, and now a mortal queen dared suggest that having many children made her superior to a goddess. Leto complained to her children. "Your mother is insulted," she told Apollo and Artemis. "A mortal queen in Thebes claims she's better than me because she has more children than I do. She mocks you by suggesting you're worth less than her mortal offspring. Will you let this insult stand?" Apollo and Artemis loved their mother fiercely. They'd defended her before, when the giant Tityos had tried to rape Leto. Apollo and Artemis shot him down together. They wouldn't tolerate Niobe's insult. They took their bows, Apollo's silver, Artemis's golden, and traveled to Thebes to exact vengeance. They found Niobe's sons practicing athletics in the gymnasium, exercising and training as young men did. Without warning, without chance for defense or escape, Apollo began shooting. His arrows flew true, each one finding a son, each one bringing instant death. One by one, Niobe's 7 sons fell, struck down by divine arrows. The gymnasium became a slaughterhouse, beautiful youths dying one after another, unable to flee or fight back against a god's archery. Niobe heard the news and rushed out, devastated. Her pride was shattered. Her boasting turned to ashes. She fell before her remaining children, her 7 daughters, and begged for mercy. "You've punished me," she cried to the sky. "You've shown your power. I was wrong to boast. Please spare my daughters. Don't take them all." But Apollo and Artemis weren't satisfied. The insult had been too great, the hubris too extreme. Artemis stepped forward with her own bow. While Niobe watched, unable to protect them, unable to do anything but witness, Artemis shot down each of Niobe's daughters. 7 more arrows, 7 more deaths. until all 14 of Niobe's children lay dead. Niobe's grief was beyond measure. She'd lost everything. All 14 children dead in a single day. Killed because of her own foolish pride. She was destroyed by grief, unable to move or speak or cry. According to legend, Zeus took pity on her and transformed her into a rock on Mount Sipylus. But even as stone, Niobe continued to weep, water flowing from the rock like tears. Eternal mourning for children lost to divine vengeance. The Niobe story was told and retold throughout ancient Greece. It appeared in poetry, drama, and art. It was a cautionary tale about hubris. Don't compare yourself favorably to the gods. Don't boast about blessings that could be taken away. Don't forget that mortals and immortals occupy different categories of existence. Niobe's tragedy demonstrated that the gods demanded respect, that pride invited disaster, that insulting divine mothers brought terrible consequences. But Apollo's arrows didn't only punish individual offenders, he could also bring plague to entire populations. His arrows spreading disease and death across cities and armies. This aspect of Apollo might seem contradictory. He was god of healing, yet also brought plague. But the Greeks understood that healing and harming were two expressions of the same power. The god who knew how to cure disease also knew how to cause it. The arrows that brought death could be withdrawn to bring healing. The Iliad opens with Apollo bringing plague against the Greek army at Troy. Agamemnon, the Greek commander, had dishonored Apollo's priest Chryses, refusing to return Chryses' daughter, who had been taken as a war prize, and insulting the priest when he came with ransom. Chryses prayed to Apollo for vengeance, and Apollo responded by shooting his arrows into the Greek camp. But these weren't physical arrows visible to mortal eyes. They were arrows of disease, invisible shafts that brought plague. For 9 days, Apollo's plague ravaged the Greeks. Soldiers died by the hundreds. The funeral pyres burned constantly. Finally, Achilles called an assembly and demanded they consult a prophet to learn why the gods were angry. When the seer Calchas revealed that Agamemnon's dishonoring of Apollo's priest had brought this plague, Agamemnon was forced to return the girl and make proper offerings to Apollo. Only then did Apollo stop shooting his plague arrows, and the sickness ended. This story established a pattern. Apollo brought disease when proper respect was denied, but he could also cure disease when proper offerings and respect were restored. Greek cities suffering from plague would make sacrifices to Apollo, sing paeans asking him to lift the pestilence, dedicate temples in his honor. Apollo Alexikakis, Apollo the Averter, was a title emphasizing his power to ward off evil, particularly disease. Apollo's arrows also featured in his intervention in the Trojan War more broadly. Apollo supported the Trojans throughout the conflict, standing against the Greeks who were trying to conquer Troy. His reasons were complex. He was angry about how the Greeks had treated his priest, and he had his own history with Troy, having once worked as a laborer there. Another story about divine servitude to mortals as punishment for offending Zeus. When the great Greek hero Achilles fought in the war, Apollo protected Trojan warriors from him. When Achilles chased Hector around Troy's walls before killing him, Apollo initially helped Hector by granting him strength and speed. When Achilles desecrated Hector's corpse by dragging it around Troy behind his chariot, Apollo protected the body from corruption and damage. But Apollo's most significant intervention came in Achilles' death. Achilles was nearly invulnerable. His mother Thetis had dipped him in the river Styx as an infant, making his skin impenetrable to weapons, except for his heel where she'd held him. Achilles seemed undefeatable in combat, killing Trojans by the hundreds, inspiring terror in Troy's defenders. Paris, the Trojan prince whose abduction of Helen had started the war, was not a great warrior. He was more lover than fighter, better at archery than close combat. But Apollo aided him. When Paris shot an arrow at Achilles, Apollo guided it. The arrow struck Achilles in his one vulnerable spot, his heel, and the wound proved fatal. The greatest Greek warrior died from an arrow guided by Apollo. Revenge for all the Trojans Achilles had slain. Apollo's archery symbolized several related concepts. First, divine justice. Apollo's arrows punished hubris, disrespect, and violations of proper order. Second, inevitability. You couldn't escape Apollo's arrows. If the god shot at you, you died. This reflected the Greek belief that divine justice, while sometimes slow, was ultimately inescapable. Third, precision. Apollo's arrows struck exactly where intended, from vast distances, never wasted. This contrasted with the chaos and waste of human warfare, showing that divine violence, when it came, was precisely calibrated to its purpose. Apollo's role as archer also connected to his role as god of plague and healing. Ancient Greeks didn't have germ theory or understand disease transmission. In modern terms, they saw plague as divine punishment. Arrows shot by angry gods, Apollo or Artemis primarily. Recovery from plague meant the gods had stopped shooting, had withdrawn their wrath, had shown mercy. Medicine and prayer were intertwined. Healing required both practical knowledge, Apollo's medical teachings through his son Asclepius, and divine favor, Apollo choosing not to send plague arrows. The far-shooting aspect of Apollo's archery had interesting implications. He could kill from Olympus, could shoot arrows that traveled from heaven to earth, could strike without being present on the battlefield. This made him terrifying in a way that gods who fought in close combat weren't. You couldn't see Apollo coming, couldn't defend against his attack, couldn't even know for certain that he was your attacker until the arrow struck. Disease worked the same way. Invisible, striking seemingly at random, killing from no visible source. Apollo's silver bow became an iconic symbol, appearing in countless artistic representations of the god, where he might also be shown with his lyre representing his artistic and civilizing aspects. The bow represented his power, his capacity for violence, his role as enforcer of divine will. Both symbols were essential. Apollo brought harmony and death, civilization and destruction, music and war. The contrast between Apollo and his half-brother Ares is instructive here. Ares was god of war, of battle, of bloodshed. But Ares represented chaotic violence, the madness and brutality of combat, war as mindless slaughter. Apollo's violence was different, precise, purposeful, judicial. Where Ares reveled in killing, Apollo killed to enforce order, to punish specific offenses, to maintain proper hierarchies. Apollo's archery was terrible, but not chaotic. It was violence in service of justice, death as punishment for transgression. This made Apollo's vengeance particularly chilling. When he decided you deserved death, it came swiftly and surely. Your best hope was to avoid offending him in the first place, to show proper respect, to honor his priests, to recognize his power and importance, to avoid hubris, Apollo's arrows were the ultimate argument for piety, the enforcement mechanism that made divine authority more than abstract concept. The god who played the lyre at divine banquets, who led the muses in song, who represented beauty and art and civilization. This same god could and would destroy entire families, could shoot down armies with plague, could guide arrows into the one vulnerable spot of seemingly invincible heroes. Apollo's dual nature, creator and destroyer, healer and plague bringer, the god of light who could darken entire cities with death, made him one of the most complex and powerful figures in Greek mythology. Apollo in the Trojan War and among heroes. Apollo's involvement in the Trojan War went beyond simply aiding individual heroes or shooting plague arrows. He was actively partisan, deeply committed to Troy's defense despite the city's ultimate doom, and his interventions throughout the 10-year conflict significantly influenced events. Understanding Apollo's role in the war helps us see how the god related to mortal affairs, how he expressed loyalty and anger, and how even divine support couldn't prevent fated outcomes. Apollo's support for Troy had complex roots. Unlike some gods whose partisanship stemmed from the judgment of Paris, Hera and Athena supported the Greeks because Paris had chosen Aphrodite over them. Apollo's reasons were more personal. Years before the war, Apollo and Poseidon had been forced to serve King Laomedon of Troy. As punishment for rebelling against Zeus, they built Troy's magnificent walls, working as laborers despite being gods. When the work was done, Laomedon refused to pay them as agreed. Poseidon, furious at being cheated, turned against Troy and supported the Greeks in the war. But Apollo's reaction was more complicated. He seems to have maintained a connection to Troy, despite Laomedon's dishonesty. Perhaps he took pride in the walls he'd built and wanted to protect them. Perhaps he sympathized with the Trojans who weren't responsible for Laomedon's crimes. Perhaps he simply chose differently than Poseidon, demonstrating divine independence rather than matching his uncle's grudge. Whatever his reasons, Apollo became Troy's most reliable divine defender. Throughout the Iliad, he repeatedly intervened to protect Trojan warriors and undermine Greek advances. When the Greeks were winning, Apollo would tip the scales back toward Troy. When Trojan heroes were in danger, Apollo would save them. He was partisan in the extreme, caring more about Troy's survival than about divine neutrality or allowing mortals to fight their own battles. One of Apollo's most significant early interventions involved the plague he sent against the Greeks after Agamemnon dishonored his priest Chryses. This plague, described in the Iliad's opening book, weakened the Greek army and created the conflict between Agamemnon and Achilles that drives much of the epic's plot. When Agamemnon was forced to return Chryses' daughter, he took Achilles' war prize Briseis as compensation, insulting the greatest Greek warrior. Achilles withdrew from fighting in anger, and without Achilles, the Greeks began to lose badly. All of this, the conflict that weakened the Greek side, the internal strife that nearly destroyed their army, the period when Troy seemed it might actually win the war, stemmed from Apollo's anger at his priest being dishonored. One god's anger at one mortal's disrespect created a crisis that shaped the entire war's middle phase. Apollo directly protected specific Trojan heroes. When the Greek warrior Diomedes was on a rampage, killing Trojans seemingly unstoppably, Apollo intervened multiple times. He shielded Aeneas, the Trojan hero and son of Aphrodite, from Diomedes' attack. He warned Diomedes to back off, reminding the mortal that gods and men weren't equal, that Diomedes shouldn't presume to fight on divine level. When Diomedes persisted, Apollo's voice grew threatening, and Diomedes finally retreated, recognizing that challenging Apollo directly would be fatal. Apollo protected Hector, Troy's greatest warrior, throughout the conflict. He gave Hector strength when the hero flagged, granted him courage when facing terrifying opponents, even physically intervened to save him from death. When Patroclus, wearing Achilles' armor and fighting brilliantly for the Greeks, pressed the Trojan lines hard and seemed on the verge of taking Troy single-handedly, Apollo stopped him. The god struck Patroclus from behind, dazing him, knocking Achilles' helmet from his head, breaking his spear, tearing off his armor. Suddenly defenseless and disoriented, Patroclus became vulnerable. Hector, seeing the opportunity Apollo had created, killed Patroclus with a spear thrust. This was arguably Apollo's most significant intervention in the war. Patroclus' death brought Achilles back into battle seeking revenge, which led to Hector's death, which ultimately contributed to Troy's fall. Apollo's action had enormous consequences, though not the ones he intended. When Achilles finally returned to battle, consumed with rage over Patroclus' death, Apollo continued trying to protect the Trojans from him. At one point, Apollo disguised himself as a Trojan warrior and lured Achilles away from the retreating Trojan army, allowing the soldiers to reach Troy's safety, while Achilles chased a god who couldn't be caught. When Achilles realized he'd been tricked and confronted Apollo, the god simply revealed himself and vanished, having accomplished his purpose of saving Trojan lives. In the barbaric confrontation between Achilles and Hector, Apollo initially helped Hector, giving him strength to run when Achilles pursued him around Troy's walls. But when Hector's fate was sealed, when Zeus weighed their destinies and Hector's side sank, indicating he was doomed, Apollo withdrew his protection. The god couldn't save someone marked for death by fate itself. Apollo left Hector to face Achilles alone, and Hector died as destiny required. After Hector's death, when Achilles desecrated the corpse by dragging it around Troy behind his chariot, Apollo protected Hector's body from corruption and damage. He shielded it with his aegis, prevented the body from being torn apart or rotting, kept it fresh and intact despite the abuse. This was a kind of honor, a way of showing respect for a fallen hero even after death. Apollo's most famous intervention came at the war's end, though the Iliad doesn't narrate this directly. When Achilles died from an arrow through his heel, it was Apollo who guided that arrow. Paris shot it, the same Paris who had started the war by abducting Helen, but Apollo's divine guidance ensured the arrow found Achilles' one vulnerable spot. The greatest warrior of the Greek army, seemingly invincible, died because Apollo helped kill him. Beyond the Trojan War, Apollo interacted with various heroes in different myths. He generally appeared as a helper, a patron, a god who aided those he favored, though favor from Apollo could be mixed blessing, given how many of his favorites ended up dead. Apollo helped Heracles occasionally, despite their complicated relationship. During Heracles' labors, Apollo offered guidance and support for some of the tasks, but Apollo also nearly fought Heracles when the hero, trying to get better oracular advice than Delphi had provided, attempted to steal the sacred tripod from Apollo's temple. The two gods grappled over the tripod until Zeus intervened, separating them and ordering Heracles to leave the oracle alone. Apollo had a cordial relationship with Artemis's favorite hunter, Orion, though this ended tragically when Orion was killed by Artemis's arrows in some versions, by a scorpion sent by various deities in others. Apollo and Artemis together killed the giant Tityos when he tried to rape their mother Leto. They also together killed all of Niobe's children when she boasted of being superior to Leto. Apollo taught medicine to his son Asclepius, who became the greatest healer in mythology. When Asclepius was killed by Zeus for overreaching, resurrecting the dead, Apollo's vengeance, killing the Cyclopes who made Zeus's thunderbolts, resulted in Apollo being forced to serve the mortal king Admetus for a year as a shepherd. But Apollo bore no grudge against Admetus, serving him well and even helping the king win his bride Alcestis. With Odysseus, the clever Greek hero, Apollo had a distant but respectful relationship. Apollo generally supported Troy, which meant opposing Odysseus, who fought for the Greeks. But after the war, when Odysseus wandered for 10 years trying to reach home, Apollo doesn't appear among his active tormentors. The god respected cleverness and strategic thinking, qualities Odysseus embodied, even though they'd technically been enemies during the war. Apollo's interactions with heroes reveal several patterns. He valued courage, but also intelligence. He supported those who showed him proper respect, but destroyed those who insulted him or his priesthood. He could be generous and helpful, but his help often came with complications. He demanded high standards. Mortals who received his favor were expected to live up to it, to show appropriate gratitude, to avoid hubris. His interventions in mortal affairs were active and frequent. Apollo wasn't a distant god who only appeared in major crises, but an engaged deity who involved himself in wars, guided individual battles, protected favored mortals, and punished offenders. This engagement made him important to mortal worshippers. Here was a god who paid attention, who intervened, whose favor made real differences in life outcomes. The Trojan War, as Apollo's most extended engagement with mortal affairs in mythology, showed him at his most partisan and active. For 10 years, he worked to protect Troy, to save Trojan heroes, to undermine Greek advantages. His efforts delayed Troy's fall, but couldn't prevent it. Fate decreed that Troy would burn, and even Apollo's active divine support couldn't change that ultimate outcome. This demonstrated an important principle in Greek thought. Even gods, for all their power, operated within limits set by fate, by necessity, by the fundamental order of things. Apollo's role in hero stories and in the Trojan War humanized him while emphasizing his power. He cared about mortals, involved himself in their conflicts, helped those he favored, and punished those who offended him. He wasn't omnipotent. He couldn't save Hector from fated death, couldn't prevent Troy's fall, couldn't protect all his favorites from disaster. But he tried, and his efforts shaped events significantly, even when they didn't change ultimate outcomes. Worship, temples, and cultural legacy. To truly understand Apollo's significance, we need to look beyond the myths and examine how he was actually worshipped, what temples were built in his honor, what festivals celebrated him, and how his influence shaped ancient Greek culture and continues to resonate today. Apollo was one of the most widely worshipped gods in ancient Greece. Nearly every Greek city had at least one temple or altar dedicated to him. His worship wasn't concentrated in a single region, but spread throughout the Greek world, from the mainland to the islands, to the colonies in Sicily, Italy, North Africa, and Asia Minor. This widespread worship reflected Apollo's importance and the multiple aspects of life he governed. The two most important cult centers for Apollo were Delphi and Delos. Delphi, on the slopes of Mount Parnassus in central Greece, was Apollo's oracular site, the location of his most famous temple, and his prophetic priestess, the Pythia. Pilgrims traveled from across the Mediterranean to consult the oracle, bringing gifts and offerings that made Delphi enormously wealthy. The sanctuary was filled with treasuries built by different Greek city-states to house their dedications, each trying to outdo the others in architectural splendor. The Temple of Apollo at Delphi went through several iterations. The first was destroyed, the second burned down, and the third, built in the 4th century BCE, was the one known to classical Greeks. Even in ruins today, the site remains impressive. The foundations of the temple, the sacred way leading up to it, the amphitheater above it, all set against dramatic mountain scenery. Ancient visitors approaching Delphi would have been awed by the location alone before even entering the sanctuary. Inside the temple's innermost chamber, the Adyton, the Pythia delivered her prophecies on specific days. The complexity of the consultation process, the preliminary sacrifices, the purification rituals, the Pythia's preparation and trance, the delivery of prophecies, their interpretation and recording, made consulting the oracle a significant undertaking, requiring time, money, and patience. Delos, Apollo's birthplace, became equally sacred. The island housed important temples to Apollo and Artemis, celebrating the divine twins' birth there. The Delian festival, held periodically, brought Greeks from various city-states together in religious unity. The Delian League, an alliance of Greek states formed to resist Persian invasion, was named for Delos, and initially held its treasury there, demonstrating the island's pan-Hellenic significance. Delos eventually became so sacred that certain activities were prohibited there. No one could be born or die on the island. Pregnant women had to leave before giving birth. The dying were transported elsewhere. This preserved Delos's purity as a sacred space set apart from normal life's beginnings and endings. The Pythian Games, held every 4 years at Delphi, were one of 4 major pan-Hellenic athletic festivals, along with Olympic, Nemean, and Isthmian Games. But unlike the others, the Pythian Games emphasized musical and artistic competitions as much as athletics. Events included lyre playing, singing, poetry recitation, and drama, alongside foot races, wrestling, chariot racing, and other athletic contests. Winners received wreaths of laurel, Apollo's sacred plant, rather than olive or celery crowns given at other games. The Pythian Games commemorated Apollo's defeat of Python and his taking of the Delphic sanctuary. The athletic events honored Apollo as god of youth and physical excellence. The artistic events honored him as leader of the Muses and patron of music, poetry, and arts. Together, these competitions celebrated Apollo's multiple domains in a single festival that attracted competitors and spectators from throughout the Greek world. Apollo's worship involved numerous festivals and rituals throughout the Greek calendar. Paeans, hymns of praise, petition, or thanksgiving, were sung to Apollo at various occasions. Before battles, asking for victory. After battles, thanking for success. During plague, begging for healing. At celebrations, expressing joy. The paean had a distinctive rhythm and structure, immediately recognizable as belonging to Apollo. Sacrifices to Apollo typically involved young animals, lambs, goats, sometimes cattle. The animals were decorated with ribbons and garlands, led to the altar, and killed with proper ritual. Parts were burned as offerings to the god. Parts were cooked and eaten by worshippers in a communal feast. This sacrifice wasn't seen as grim or morbid, but as a joyful offering, sharing food with the god while acknowledging his power and importance. Apollo's priesthood at major sanctuaries like Delphi held significant political influence. The priests managed the oracle's operations, interpreted the Pythia's pronouncements, advised those seeking prophecies. They accumulated wealth from offerings, controlled access to the god's wisdom, and wielded power that extended beyond religious matters into politics, warfare, colonization. In mythology and worship, Apollo was associated with numerous animals, plants, and symbols. The laurel tree was his most important plant symbol, sacred because of Daphne's transformation. Laurel wreaths crowned victors and poets. Laurel leaves were chewed by the Pythia. Laurel branches decorated Apollo's temples and altars. The dolphin was Apollo's sacred animal, commemorating a myth where he transformed himself into a dolphin to guide Cretan sailors to Delphi to become his priests. The swan was associated with Apollo as a symbol of beauty and grace. The raven or crow connected to Apollo's prophetic knowledge. Ravens were considered birds of prophecy, though Apollo also turned them black as punishment in the Corona story. The lyre remained Apollo's most important symbol after his bow. Representations of Apollo almost always showed him holding or playing the lyre, emphasizing his role as divine musician and leader of the muses. The seven-stringed lyre represented cosmic harmony, the mathematical relationships underlying both music and the cosmos. The tripod, the three-legged stool on which the Pythia sat, became synonymous with Apollo and prophecy. Representations of Delphi often featured the tripod. Stealing Apollo's tripod, as Heracles attempted, was a grave offense, attacking the very seat of prophetic power. Apollo's influence on Greek culture extended far beyond formal worship. He represented ideals that permeated Greek thought: youth and beauty, artistic achievement, rational thought, civilized order, proper balance between extremes. The concept of Apollonian versus Dionysian, rational order versus ecstatic chaos, clarity versus intoxication, structure versus dissolution, became a fundamental way Greeks understood different aspects of life and different approaches to existence. When Greeks founded colonies in new territories, they consulted Apollo's oracle at Delphi about where to settle and how to organize their new cities. Apollo thus became associated with colonization and the spread of Greek culture. Cities founded based on Delphic advice often built prominent temples to Apollo, honoring the god whose prophecy had guided them. In philosophy, Apollo's temple at Delphi bore two famous inscriptions: "Know thyself" and "Nothing in excess." These maxims embodied Apollonian wisdom, self-knowledge, moderation, avoiding extremes. Greek philosophers, particularly Socrates, took these principles seriously, building ethical systems around self-examination and moderation. Apollo's influence continued beyond ancient Greece. When the Romans adopted Greek gods, they took Apollo directly, keeping his Greek name rather than translating it. or identifying him with a native Roman deity. Apollo became important in Roman religion, with temples in Rome and throughout the empire. The Roman Emperor Augustus was particularly devoted to Apollo, building magnificent temples and promoting Apollo worship as part of his cultural program. During the Renaissance, when European artists and thinkers rediscovered classical culture, Apollo became a central figure in art and literature. Countless paintings depicted scenes from his myths: Apollo and Daphne, Apollo and the Muses, Apollo slaying Python, Apollo driving his chariot, conflated with Helios, the sun god, pulling the sun across the sky. Sculptures showed Apollo's ideal beauty, representing classical perfection. In Enlightenment thought, Apollo represented reason, order, rationality, qualities Enlightenment thinkers valued. The Apollonian ideal influenced architecture, art, philosophy, even politics. The worship of reason that characterized Enlightenment culture drew partly on ancient reverence for Apollo as god of rational thought and ordered harmony. In modern culture, Apollo remains present in numerous ways. NASA named its moon landing program Apollo, suggesting reaching for the sun god's heights, achieving divine level accomplishment through human ingenuity. The word Apollonian remains in philosophical and psychological vocabulary, contrasting rational order with Dionysian chaos. Art schools, music conservatories, and cultural institutions name themselves after Apollo, claiming connection to his patronage of arts. The oracle at Delphi, though long silent, remains one of the most famous ancient sites. Tourists visit the ruins, stand where the Pythia once sat, look out over the valley that ancient pilgrims saw when they came seeking divine wisdom. The site preserves cultural memory of a time when God spoke directly to humans, when prophecy shaped history, when Apollo's voice could be heard through his priestess. Apollo's myths continue to inspire artists, writers, and musicians. The story of Apollo and Daphne has been retold countless times, reinterpreted through various cultural lenses. Bernini's Baroque sculpture remains one of the most famous artworks in existence. Modern poets continue writing about Apollo's loves, his music, his prophecies. The concept of the oracle, of divine prophecy, of seeking guidance from higher powers, remains culturally resonant even for people who don't believe in Greek gods. Consulting oracles, reading omens, seeking signs. These impulses persist in various forms, from tarot readings to astrology to consulting various kinds of advisors. Apollo's oracle might be closed, but the human desire for knowledge about the future, for guidance in difficult decisions, for access to wisdom beyond normal human knowledge, continues. Apollo's legacy as god of music and arts influences how we think about artistic inspiration. The concept of the muse, of creative inspiration coming from outside the artist, of being channels for something larger than themselves, derives from Greek understanding of Apollo and the Muses. When poets speak of inspiration, when musicians feel they've channeled something beyond their ordinary abilities, they're echoing ancient beliefs about Apollo's role in artistic creation. The god of light, prophecy, music, healing, and archery left an enormous cultural footprint that extends far beyond ancient Greece. His temples, though often ruined, remain monuments to ancient piety and artistic achievement. His myths continue generating interpretations, adaptations, reflections. His symbols, lyre, laurel, bow, tripod, remain recognizable elements of classical culture. Apollo, the most beautiful of gods, the far shooter, the Lord of Delphi, continues to illuminate our understanding of beauty, truth, art, and the complex relationship between mortals and the divine. Conclusion: the god of light and shadow. As we emerge from this deep exploration of Apollo's mythology, what becomes clear is that he was never a simple god, never easily categorized or understood. The contradictions that defined him, creator and destroyer, healer and plague bringer, rational god of prophecy who experienced irrational passionate love, beautiful god whose relationships ended in tragedy, made him one of the most complex and human deities in the Greek pantheon. Apollo represented the heights of divine accomplishment and the depths of divine suffering. He slew Python and conquered Delphi, establishing the most important oracle in the ancient world. He mastered the lyre and led the muses, creating music that made even gods pause to listen. His prophecies shaped Greek history for 1,000 years. His archery brought divine justice to those who defied proper order. He was beautiful, talented, powerful, accomplished beyond measure. Yet this same god lost nearly everyone he loved. Daphne fled from him and became a tree. Hyacinthus died in his arms from an accident Apollo couldn't prevent. Coronis betrayed him, and his vengeful response killed both her and nearly his own unborn son. Cassandra rejected him, and his curse made her gift of prophecy a burden. His romantic life was marked by loss, tragedy, and sorrow that even divine power couldn't prevent or fix. This duality, triumph in his divine domains, tragedy in his personal life, made Apollo relatable despite his godhood. He showed that even immortals suffered, that even perfect beauty didn't guarantee happiness, that power and accomplishment didn't protect against heartbreak. The god of prophecy, who could see the future somehow, couldn't foresee or prevent the tragedies that befell those he loved. Apollo's birth story, with his mother Leto persecuted and wandering, set the pattern for his life. He came into the world through suffering, born after 9 days of impossible labor, emerging on a barren island that had nowhere else to go. This difficult beginning shaped him. He understood persecution, suffering, the courage required to endure when all seemed lost. His protection of his mother, his fierce vengeance on those who disrespected Leto, showed that he remembered where he came from and honored the goddess who suffered to bring him forth. His conquest of Delphi demonstrated his power and established his most important cult center. The oracle he created there shaped Greek civilization for centuries, guiding colonization, warfare, politics, religious practice. Through the Pythia, Apollo spoke to mortals, offering wisdom, often cryptic, always ambiguous, but genuine. The very ambiguity of oracular prophecy reflected truth's complexity, the multiple possibilities inherent in every future, the role of human choice and interpretation in fulfilling or avoiding prophesied outcomes. His mastery of music represented civilization itself. Apollo's lyre brought harmony to chaos, mathematical order to sound, beauty to existence. As leader of the muses, he inspired all creative endeavor, reminding mortals that art required divine gift, as well as human skill. His musical contests, though ending in terrible punishments for those who challenged him, reinforced the principle that some standards were absolute, that divine artistry truly surpassed mortal achievement. His tragic loves revealed his vulnerability and humanity. Every failed romance, every transformation and death, every curse and loss showed a god who felt deeply, loved intensely, and suffered profoundly. The laurel that crowned victors carried Daphne's memory. The hyacinth that bloomed in spring remembered Hyacinthus. The unbelieved prophecies echoed Cassandra's curse. Apollo's losses became permanent symbols, forever reminding Greeks that even gods experience tragedy in love. His archery represented justice and power. The far-shooting god whose arrows never missed, whose vengeance was terrible and certain. Niobe's children fell before his arrows. Achilles died from an arrow he guided. Plague swept through armies when he was angered. This power demonstrated that divine authority was real, that respect was required, that hubris brought swift and terrible consequences. His involvement in human affairs, particularly the Trojan War, showed an engaged god who cared about mortal outcomes. He worked actively to protect Troy, to save Trojan heroes, to undermine Greek advantages. His partisan support couldn't prevent fate from unfolding, but it demonstrated that gods weren't distant or disinterested observers, but active participants in human history. Apollo's worship shaped Greek culture fundamentally. His oracle guided decisions large and small. His festivals brought Greeks together in shared celebration. His temples showcased architectural and artistic achievement. His priesthoods wielded significant power. His ideals, beauty, order, rationality, moderation, artistic excellence, became Greek ideals, shaping how Greeks understood themselves and their culture. The god's legacy extends far beyond ancient Greece. Renaissance artists depicted his myths. Enlightenment thinkers embraced his rational, orderly nature. Modern culture preserves his symbols and stories. The concept of Apollonian order versus Dionysian chaos remains philosophically useful. The desire for prophecy, for divine guidance, for artistic inspiration, for beauty and truth. These impulses Apollo embodied continue shaping human culture. If you've enjoyed this deep exploration of Apollo's mythology, his miraculous birth, his conquest of Delphi and establishment of the oracle, his mastery of music and the arts, his tragic love affairs with Daphne, Hyacinthus, Coronis, and Cassandra, his terrible archery and acts of vengeance, his role in the Trojan War, and his profound influence on ancient worship and modern culture, please consider subscribing to this channel and liking this video. There are countless more stories from Greek mythology waiting to be explored. Countless more gods and goddesses whose myths reveal timeless truths. Countless more heroes whose adventures teach lessons that remain relevant across millennia. Until next time, may you find harmony in your life's music, clarity in times of confusion, and courage to endure when challenges seem impossible. The God of Light still illuminates our understanding of beauty and truth. The oracle may be silent, but the human need for wisdom continues. Apollo's legacy, complex, contradictory, brilliant, and tragic, reminds us that perfection doesn't exist, that even gods experience sorrow, that beauty and tragedy often intertwine, and that light always casts shadows. The Golden God bids you farewell until we meet again in the realm of ancient stories and eternal truths.